Where does Western civilization come from? Where does the United States come from? Unless you understand where you came from on the one hand and where you are going on the other hand, unless you understand both of those two things, you're going to struggle mightily to be able to deconstruct and to make sense of the present. One of the things that we like to do here on the Josh Hammer Show is to zoom out and focus on the broader picture. We like to focus on the bigger questions, not just the day-to-day news cycle, but the really meaty, hard-hitting, 35,000-foot altitude view level stuff. The big questions such as, who are we? Where do we come from? Not literally where do we come from as human beings, but where does Western civilization come from? Where does the United States come from? Unless you understand where you came from on the one hand and where you are going on the other hand, unless you understand both of those two things, you're going to struggle mightily to be able to deconstruct and to make sense of the present. We've been witnessing over the past couple of years at least, since the October 7, 2023 Hamas pogrom, but really accelerating in recent months, probably accelerating above all, I would say, in the aftermath of the assassination of my late friend Charlie Kirk. Tragically, about a month and a half ago in Utah, we have been seeing this concerted effort by certain folks to argue that the United States of America and that what we today call Western civilization is not in any way rooted. It has no basis in the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, the story of the ancient Israelites, the Jewish people, and so forth. And so, many of these same provocateurs like to argue, taking it to its logical conclusion. And so, the United States will be just fine, they say, and Western civilization will be just fine, by simply writing the Jews and writing the Jewish state of Israel, just writing it all out of the picture. We saw a lot of this, as I mentioned, after October 7, 2023, and we've seen a lot more of it in recent months. I took this question to heart. The question of what is Western civilization? What is the role of the Jewish people? What is the role of the Bible, of the Hebrew Scriptures in the formation, the development, and the very identity, the very crux of Western civilization? I addressed all this head on in my book that came out earlier this year, Israel and Civilization, The Fate of the Jewish Nation and the Destiny of the West. A book title for which the word Israel is something of a double entendre. It's referring, yes, to the state of Israel to an extent, but it's really above all referring to the Jewish people, to the Hebrew Bible, to the Old Testament, the part of the Christian Bible that is roughly, give or take, 75% of the Christian Bible. You have to understand the importance of the Hebrew Bible and understand the importance of how the American founders, of how they understood the Hebrew Bible to make sense of any of this. Because ever since that pogrom happened on October 7, 2023, we've seen something of an inflection point. We saw a lot of folks who were completely confused, at best, as to who to side with between Israel and Hamas. We saw that confusion play out all the way until the Trump-orchestrated ceasefire and hostage deal of October 13th, 2025. We saw it forever. And these folks were fundamentally confused as to what Western civilization is. If you are unable to morally discern between Israel, between Hamas, if you are unable to morally distinguish between these entities, if you are morally unable to distinguish between the original people of the book, the Jewish people, and a radical Islamist, Sharia supremacist, jihadist, terrorist organization, then you have lost the plot, and you are unable to give any kind of answer as to what is Western civilization today? That is the focus of today's show, is what is Western civilization? And what is the role of the Bible, and perhaps above all, the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, in the formation and the understanding of Western civilization? Now, Western civilization is oftentimes understood as this DNA-like double helix. So if you remember Watson and Crick, the folks who discovered the DNA strands, modern genealogy back in the mid-20th century, if you remember their discovery, you have this strand of these two interwoven helixes. Well, many folks have oftentimes described Western civilization as a DNA-like double helix strand, where those two strands are reason, on the one hand, rooted in Greece and Rome, Greco-Roman reason, really Greek thought, and Aristotle and Plato above all. You have reason on one hand, and then you have revelation on the other hand. Athens and Jerusalem, reason, revelation. This is the argument famously put forth by Leo Strauss. Leo Strauss, who was a 20th century political science professor at the University of Chicago. Now, I'm not here to quibble with that. I'm not necessarily here to say that reason has no role to play, that there is truly no role for reason when it comes to logic, when it comes to analysis, when it comes to policy, when it comes to law, when it comes to culture, when it comes to the building blocks of Western civilization. I'm not here to make that claim. What I am here to say is that the role of reason has been overstated. The role of reason has been remarkably overstated. Let me put it to you this way. If you were to close your eyes, and if you were to truly think that you can just use reason, use the good old noggin, this right here between the ears, and use this to deduce and to arrive at moral truth, perhaps you think that you can do that. And maybe you actually might be able to do that to an extent. You very well might be able, it's entirely possible that if you were born behind the old veil of ignorance, to use the Rawlsian language, it's entirely possible that you would be able to deduce that murder is wrong, that violence is wrong, thou shalt not steal, and so forth. It's possible. I'm not saying it's given, but it's possible. But there are any number of people who have failed to do this, who have used reason to arrive at all sorts of utterly horrific and catastrophic conclusions. To give just one example, the Nazi Germans thought they were acting reasonably. Their whole social order of the Nazis of the 1930s into 1940s in Germany was based on their idea of reason. Various Nazi social doctrines, such as the doctrine of Lebensraum, if I'm getting my German correctly here, Lebensraum, which was this horrific notion of compassion for those less fortunate, which was their way of justifying all sorts of horrific eugenics and experiments when it comes to lobotomies and things like that on others. It was that emphasis on eugenics that had the result, that is to say, of the train tracks leading to Auschwitz, Birkenau, and Treblinka. This is what happens when you start to think about reason, absent anything to tether that reason to. The Leninists and the Stalinists and the Soviet Union, they all thought they were acting reasonably too. Has there ever been a totalitarian government on the face of this earth that did not think that it was acting reasonably? Has there ever been an Islamist Sharia supremacist movement that does not deliberately think it is acting reasonably? Do you think that Al-Qaeda or ISIS or Hamas, when they engage in the various atrocities of the day, do you think that they are telling themselves when they go to sleep that night, man, I acted so evil and I am so proud of myself? No, they think that they are doing the right thing. They think that they are acting reasonably. So again, reason has a role to play, but it is imperative that reason be used exclusively for secondary and tertiary levels of analysis. you have to start somewhere else. You need something else, to paraphrase Alexander Hamilton writing in one of the Federalist Papers, Federalist number 31, one of the essays written in support of ratification of the U.S. Constitution in the late 1780s. Hamilton, writing in Federalist 31, writes that there are certain anchoring truths and first principles upon which all subsequent levels of analysis depend. He was right. The question is, what are those principles? What are those truths? And absent those truths and absent those principles, how quickly we see how, quote-unquote, reasonable analysis can go off the rails so entirely quickly. Western civilization began in earnest, that is to say, not with Greco-Roman reason, but with revelation. It began in earnest with God's initial revelation to Moses and the Israelites standing there at the base of the fiery Mount Sinai. This is the earth-shattering revelation that forever established the original covenants and all that the biblical law and biblical truth would soon then encapsulate and embody. There is no greater truth proclaimed in the Bible. We said this in the opening episode of our relaunch show as part of our partnership between Newsweek and Salem Media Group. In our opening show, we talked briefly about the importance of Genesis 1:27. This proclamation, right in the very beginning verses of the entire Bible. And God created man in his image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. This is the single foundational ethical underpinning of the entire world. In Hebrew, we would say B'Tselem Elohim, Imago Dei, and perhaps the more familiar Latin. This is entirely crucial. Indeed, it is indispensable in understanding the relationship between man and his fellow man, between man and the world around him, between man and his creator. Do not think for a second that the United States of America would have been able to write the flowery equality, equal under law rhetoric of the Declaration of Independence of 1776, the 14th Amendment and the Equal Protection Clause in 1868, the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Do not think for a second that any of that would have been possible absent the overarching civilizational context of the divine image truth proclamation asserted in Genesis chapter 1, verse 27. It's true that Thomas Jefferson, in writing the Declaration in 1776, did argue that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. They are endowed by the Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Hold aside for a second that he really was just, in many ways, aping or mimicking the language of John Locke, writing about 1 century prior in England. For Locke, it was life, liberty, and property, not the pursuit of happiness. Hold that aside. But with all due respect to these assertions of self-evidence, just think about this logically for a second. Dare I say, think about it reasonably. Would the notion of a universal inalienable right to life, liberty, and property or pursuit of happiness, would that be self-evident to Taliban goat herders in Afghanistan? Would that be self-evident to sub-Saharan African tribal warlords? Probably not. I would argue definitely not. Rather, the reason that men like Locke in England and Jefferson in the colonial United States were able to write those words, even to appeal to self-evident truth, is that they did not write them in a vacuum. They wrote them in the overarching cultural and civilizational context, in the milieu of the Judeo-Christian biblical inheritance going back thousands of years. Genesis 1:27 really is the crux, the very crux of who we are and all that we believe. The Hebrew Bible and the Jewish tradition, though, it's not all about individual liberty or individualism. Genesis 1:27, make no doubt about it, the divine image imperative. This is the foundation for all societies today that operate according to fealty, loyalty to the Bible, that is the foundation for individual dignity, for equality under law, for treating all others with respect. No doubt about that. But you can't just take that principle and then say that you have an abstract right to do anything and everything. Nor is this merely the same thing as classical liberalism. Think about John Stuart Mill, writing in the late 19th century. We recall from Mill his famous principle, the so-called harm principle. The notion that you have a right to act according to that which you please, unless and until you harm someone in some tangible, physical, property, personal, bodily autonomy, etc. way. But that's not really actually the Jewish approach at all, actually. There's a famous line that I'm gonna read here. It's in the Talmudic tractate Shabbat, actually, on the laws of the Jewish Sabbath. And it says, anyone who had the capability to effectively protest the sinful conduct of the members of his household and did not protest, he himself is apprehended for the sins of the members of his household and punished. If he is in a position to protest the sinful conduct of the people of his town and he fails to do so, he is apprehended for the sins of the people of his town. If he is in a position to protest the sinful conduct of the whole world and he fails to do so, he is apprehended for the whole world's sins. That is not a libertarian or hyper-individualistic assessment. If you have the position to stop the sinful conduct of the whole world and you fail to do so, then you are responsible for the sins of the whole world. That is a communitarian emphasis. That is a strong emphasis on an individual responsibility when it comes to protecting, securing, and realizing the common good of the masses, the common good of the community, of the nation, perhaps even the world. So this whole tension between individual dignity and this notion of the common good and the general welfare, which is the singular foundational tension around which all Western political theory depends. Really, this is a Jewish Hebraic contribution there. On the one hand, you have Genesis 1:27. On the other hand, you have communitarian points of emphasis throughout the Hebrew Bible. This notion in the Exodus chapter 19 that at Mount Sinai during the Revelation, God says to the Israelites, you are to be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. Talking here about communal holiness, collective holiness. Not necessarily just individual, but collective. And again, this healthy tension between individual moral worth and the community, this really is the tension upon which all subsequent Western political theory revolves. Another thing that the Hebrew Bible gives the world is the foundations of what today we might refer to as economic conservatism. There is no room for socialism or Marxism in the Bible, as so many like Rabbi Daniel Lapin have argued persuasively over the years. Socialism violates literally at least 2 of the 10 commandments right there in the Bible. Thou shalt not steal, and thou shalt not covet. Covet others' possessions. That's socialism. That is Marxism. So yes, there is an important emphasis here on the common good. You have to care about the welfare of your fellow. You have to be willing and able to support them in need. But there's no room whatsoever for socialism or Marxism. Maybe the other single most important ethical rule in the entire Bible, other than the divine image imperative of Genesis 1:27, would be Leviticus chapter 19, verse 18. This is the exhortation about the golden rule. Look, when I was in kindergarten, I learned the golden rule: treat others as you want to be treated. I wasn't aware that this was a biblical principle. Maybe it's because I went to public school growing up. I don't know. I was not taught that this was right out of the Bible, but sure enough, it is. Leviticus chapter 19 says, quote, you shall neither take revenge from nor bear a grudge against the members of your people. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. Folks, the golden rule, you shall love your neighbor as yourself, which is not a cry to open borders. Okay, letting in a bunch of Somalis or whatever, that's not a neighbor. Okay, someone from Mogadishu is not my neighbor in the sense that he has an unambiguous legal or moral right to come here to the United States. No. But when you establish the political community, the polity, as Aristotle would have called it, when you have the polity, you do have an obligation to treat your actual neighbor as your fellow. This is how you establish the notion of interdependent mutual bonds of loyalty, where you have some sense of loyalty, of kinship to your fellow citizens. That is the building block of a society, without which no society can possibly hope to cohere. There's no chance for a society that lacks utterly any respect for Leviticus 19:18. In fact, there's this amazing anecdote from the same tractate in the Talmud, the tractate on Shabbat, the rules the Jewish have. There's this amazing anecdote where you have these two dueling titans back in the day of Jewish law. You have Hillel and Shammai. And Hillel was known for taking a more lenient stance on these questions. Shammai was very strict and perhaps a little curmudgeonly. So the story goes as follows. There was a non-Jew, a Gentile, who approached both Hillel and Shammai and asked inquisitively, I am interested in converting to Judaism, but only on the notion, or only on the condition, that you teach me the entirety of the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, the very core of the Hebrew Bible, that you teach me the entirety of the Torah while standing on one foot. Shammai, who again was the stricter, more curmudgeonly of the two, looks at this and says, get out of here, you poser. What are you talking about? This is silly. I'm not going to entertain this. I'm not going to deign this by taking it seriously. I'm not going to dignify it. But Hillel actually responded seriously. He chose to respectfully engage. What Hillel said to this interlocutor was he got on one leg and he said, what is hateful to you, do not do to your neighbor. That is the whole Torah. The rest is the explanation of this. Go and study it. So the golden rule, to treat your neighbor as your own fellow, to love your neighbor as your own fellow, that to Hillel, this great sage, was the very core, the singular embodiment, the quintessence of the Hebrew Bible. So many other parts of our day-to-day lives that we could go on and on about as well when it comes to concepts that date back to the Hebrew Bible. There's, just to name a couple examples, how about federalism? A lot of people think that federalism, America's system of dual spheres of sovereignty between the federal government and the state governments, a lot of folks think that this comes perhaps from the UK, where there's Westminster and London devolving power to Scotland and Wales and so forth there. Well, really, maybe to an extent for sure. America's legal system is definitely heavily predicated and based on the English and British model, but we might even go further and say this goes back to the Hebrew Bible as well. Jeremiah chapter 29 famously has the exhortation from Jeremiah the prophet, where he is begging the exiled Jews to display civil loyalty to their local jurisdiction. And he says, quote, seek the peace of the city where I have exiled you and pray for it to the Lord, because you shall find welfare there in your locality. It's really not much of a leap to get from that Jeremiah notion about seeking the welfare of your locality. It's not much of a leap to get from that to the Catholic principle of subsidiarity, of having local governance typically being the best, constitutional federalism, and so forth there. How about the very notion of being above the law? This is a fun one. How many times in recent years have we heard the left say, Donald Trump is above the law? You can't be above the law. No one is above the law. We hear this debate so often, especially during the throes of the Joe Biden, Merrick Garland, Jack Smith, Democrat lawfare complex, when they were prosecuting Donald Trump among other political foes. We heard this over and over and over again. What a lot of Donald Trump's political opponents at that time probably did not realize, and they probably don't realize it today either, is that what they were really saying there was right out of the Hebrew Bible, right out of Deuteronomy chapter 17. In Deuteronomy chapter 17, it says that the king of Israel back in the day was bound by the law. In fact, the king of Israel actually had to himself personally write 2 Torah scrolls, 2 Bibles over the course of his lifetime. Why? So that he may read it and study it every day of the life, so that he may be bound by it. In fact, John Fortescue, a name you probably never heard of, and an old English common lawyer, a conservative from the late 14th century, early 15th century, give or take, when he codified this notion as part of the English common law, when he said that the King of England is not above the law, he literally cited the book of Deuteronomy. The notion the king is not above the law is a Deuteronomistic, a biblical principle. The founders of America did not take any of this for granted. Frankly, even before the founders, the pilgrims before them didn't take it for granted either. The pilgrims who sailed across the Atlantic on the Mayflower in 1620, they conscientiously saw themselves as new Israelites fleeing their version of Egypt across their version of the Red Sea. There was actually even chatter, believe it or not, on the Mayflower about possibly ditching the English language. After all, they were fleeing oppression, persecution in England. There was talk of possibly just ditching the English language and just speaking Hebrew anew. That didn't fly, of course, but there was indeed some chatter about it. In fact, Sir William Bradford, who was the captain of the Mayflower, later served as the second governor of Plymouth Colony, spoke about 1,000 words of Hebrew because he was a student of a well-known Christian Hebraist, kind of an outmoded term that refers to someone who was a scholar of the ancient Hebrew scripture and culture and language, so forth. So Bradford was a student of an old English Christian Hebraist named Sir Henry Ainsworth. He was the captain of the Mayflower, second governor of Plymouth Colony. Bradford once said that after his death, he would speak, quote, the most ancient language, Hebrew, and he would do that to converse with God and angels in the world to come and the afterlife. The American founders certainly themselves, fast-forwarding from the Pilgrims, did not take any of this for granted in the slightest. President George Washington, a man of faith himself, wrote this beautiful letter to the Jews of Newport, Rhode Island. Then about 25 families, actually the biggest Jewish community in America, in the Washington presidency in 1790 specifically, when Washington wrote this beautiful letter. In this letter that Washington writes to the Jews of Newport, Rhode Island, he says, quote, the children of the stock of Abraham who dwell in this land shall sit in safety under his own vine and fig tree, and there shall be none to make him afraid. Washington, for what it's worth, was also known to be personally friendly with Chaim Solomon, who was a Polish-born Jewish merchant, best known as a leading financier of both the Continental Congress and the American Revolutionary War. In fact, if you have a $1 bill and you flip it over, you look at the Great Seal of the United States, you might see a little Star of David. And it's not confirmed, but there are many historians who speculate that this little Star of David there in the midst of the present United States seal was Washington's way of actually honoring his friend, Chaim Solomon. Benjamin Franklin, for what it's worth, proposed that the national seal of the United States be Moses parting the Red Sea with the Israelites trailing behind him. Thomas Jefferson, no one's idea of an Orthodox Christian believer, someone who literally tore out pages of his Bible where he didn't like the miracles, especially in the New Testament. Even Jefferson, despite those radical, one might even say heretical beliefs, even Jefferson saw fit to argue that the seal of his colony, Virginia, that seal also be Moses leading the Israelites across the Red Sea. There's so many examples to count here. I'll just give you some of my very favorite ones. Abraham Lincoln, my single favorite figure in American history, a man on whose birthday I was born. Lincoln famously said in his speech just prior, 2 months, give or take, prior to the opening shots fired at Fort Sumter and the beginning of the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln famously says in this speech in Trenton, New Jersey, that Americans were something of a, quote, almost chosen people. An almost chosen people. Deliberate language from Lincoln, clearly evoking the covenant found in the 5 books of Moses, the Abrahamic covenant. Lincoln, for what it's worth, would cite the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, all throughout his presidency. He did it over and over and over again. In particular, just to give one example, if you look at his second inaugural address, given tragically just about a month and a half or so prior to his assassination at Ford Theater in the nation's capital, Lincoln's second inaugural address in 1865, the one that famously ends with malice for none, with charity for all, he refers to binding up the nation's wounds, a clear, unmistakable reference to Psalms, chapter 147. A psalm, by the way, that observant Jews, like myself, recite every single morning. There's another wonderful anecdote involving Lincoln, who was somewhat of a private man. Among the only people that Lincoln ever referred to as one of his close personal friends was actually a fellow lawyer back from Illinois, where Lincoln rose to political prominence. There was a fellow lawyer there, a man by the name of Jonas, one of the only men that Lincoln ever referred to as a close personal friend. This man happened to be Jewish. But an amazing story happens. In the middle of the war, around 1862 to 1863, Ulysses S. Grant issues an unambiguously anti-Semitic edict, where he effectively kicks the Jewish soldiers fighting for the Union against the Confederate insurrection. He kicks them out of the regiment there in their Midwestern location, Illinois, Indiana, or some such. So the Jewish soldiers were not happy about this. So they took a train or a horse and buggy or however one traveled to get from the Midwest to the nation's capital. At then they arrive in D.C., and this was once upon a time where you were able apparently to get a face-to-face sit-down with the President of the United States. So these Jewish soldiers, unceremoniously booted out of Grant's army, find themselves in a face-to-face sit-down with the President of the United States. And the interaction apparently goes as follows. Abraham Lincoln says, "And so the children of Israel were driven from the happy land of Canaan. A man by the name of Caskell, one of the Jewish soldiers who was tasked to represent the group in front of the President of the United States, Caskell says, 'Yes, and that is why we have come unto Father Abraham's bosom, seeking protection.' And Lincoln says, 'And this protection they shall have at once.' And he immediately proceeds to countermand, to overturn General Grant's anti-Semitic order. Now, don't be too hard on Ulysses S. Grant. Grant ultimately formally apologized and so forth for his order, and he is to be forgiven. But the point is that Lincoln, like Washington, like so many before them, understood that the Hebrew Bible, the original people of the book, the Jewish people, this is all the bedrock upon which his own religion, Christianity, sits. This is the bedrock upon which the United States of America sits, the bedrock upon which all of Western civilization, for that matter, sits. 2 more amazing quotes for you. 2 of my absolute favorite quotes from the founders on this particular topic, just to show you just the level of sincere appreciation for the Jewish people, for monotheism, and for the biblical inheritance that was deeply, deeply common among the American founders. 2 more, and I promise that's it. John Adams, one of the more sincerely held, faithful Christians of all the American founders. John Adams, also a committed Philo-Semite, as you shall soon see. He wrote in this 1809 letter to a man by the name of Francois Adrien van der Kemp. He wrote, quote, "I will insist that the Hebrews have done more to civilize men than any other nation. If I were an atheist and believed in blind eternal fate, I should still believe that fate had ordained the Jews to be the most essential instrument for civilizing the nations. If I were an atheist of the other sect, who believe or pretend to believe that all is ordered by chance, I should believe that chance had ordered the Jews to preserve and propagate to all mankind the doctrine of a supreme, intelligent, wise, almighty sovereign of the universe, which I believe to be the great essential principle of all morality and consequently of all civilization." What a quote. Literally saying that monotheism, the notion that there is one God, that this is the ultimate rebuke of the idolatry of the ancient pagan world. This is the ultimate rebuke today, fast forward today, of modern forms of moral relativism. This is the ultimate rebuke to DEI identity politics, wokeism, various other stripes and strands of neo-Marxism. The notion of one God, of one objective truth. This is the bedrock of what Western civilization stands for. This is the bedrock of what the United States stand for. And that, above all, really, is why John Adams saw the Jews to be the, quote, most essential instrument for civilizing the nations. Really powerful, really beautiful stuff. Alexander Hamilton, this is the final quote that I'll share with you, had very similar thoughts. He once wrote, quote, "The state and progress of the Jews from their earliest history to the present time has been so entirely out of the ordinary course of human affairs. Is it not then a fair conclusion that the cause also is an extraordinary one? In other words, that it is the effect of some great providential plan. The man who will draw this conclusion will look for the solution in the Bible. He who will not draw it ought to give us another fair solution." He's literally saying that the fact that Jewish people still exist today is proof of God's existence. Many men throughout history have made a similar claim to this. Benjamin Disraeli, the conservative British leader, made a similar claim a few decades after Hamilton did on the other side of the pond over in England. I could talk about this all day. We could do this all day long. We could talk about how Ronald Reagan famously referred to America as that shining city on a hill, the same language used by John Winthrop, the colonist in Massachusetts, some 350 years prior. That shining city on a hill in the Bible is, of course, the holy city itself, Jerusalem. The point, folks, there has been this sustained information operation waged primarily by the subjugationist forces of the left, by the forces of Marxism, neo-Marxism, Islamism, and global neoliberalism or universalism. All these forces, typically identified with the political left, are fighting to eradicate, to undermine, to ultimately overturn this biblical inheritance. All that I just suggested. There are increasingly many folks within the broader so-called right who seem interested in doing the same. I saw Tucker Carlson on his show back in August. He had a pastor on his show as the guest. The pastor's name was Cliff Neptuli, if I'm pronouncing his name correctly. And Tucker had an astonishing confession. He confessed that for the first time last year, he read the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible. A little weird, no? That someone who calls himself a Christian just read roughly 75% of his own Bible last year. It gets worse. Tucker then said that he was shocked. He was shocked and he was horrified by the violence and the murder and the genocide in the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament. Now, the pastor, the guest, to his great credit, did not take the bait. And Tucker, frankly, what he is getting at here is actually an old school form of Christian heresy known as Marcionism, named after the second century universally discredited theologian Marcion of Sinope, who famously argued that the God of the Old Testament is not the God of the Old Testament, that they are different gods. This is rejected as heresy. Seems to me to be what Tucker is arguing today. But holding aside this debate over whether he's literally a heretic on Christianity's own terms, after all, I'm an observant Jew. I'm not necessarily the one who's best equipped to call him a heretic, although it looks to me like he is. More to the point, folks like Tucker Carlson, folks like Candace Owens, all these folks would do well to just refamiliarize themselves with the story of America, with the story of George Washington's letter to the Jews of Newport, Rhode Island, with the story of John Adams' amazing works about the Hebrews as the great civilizing force of mankind, to familiarize themselves with Abraham Lincoln and how he viewed America as an almost chosen people, to refamiliarize themselves with the Liberty Bell in Philadelphia, which is famously inscribed not with Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics or a speech of Cicero from the floor of the Roman Senate. No, it is inscribed with the book of Leviticus. Leviticus chapter 25, verse 10. Thou shalt proclaim liberty throughout the land and to all the inhabitants thereof. They chose the very heart of the Hebrew Bible, Leviticus itself, to be there on the Liberty Bell. They knew what they were doing. The founders really, really knew what they were doing because they understood that an America that is solely predicated upon abstract reason or various other ancient forms of pagan thought will not survive. You need revelation. You need the Bible. And you need all of the Bible. That includes the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament. There are far too many today who have forgotten that lesson, and boy, could they use a refresher. Make sure to subscribe and like the Josh Hammer Show if you've not already done so. But for now, I'm Josh Hammer, and we'll see you again tomorrow.